Today I have for you a game that I've been wanting to cover for a long time. It's one of the greatest ever played, and when it comes to the absolute domination of one's opponent to the point where they can hardly make a move, there's really nothing like it. It features what is probably the most famous and devastating entrenchment of a knight deep into the enemy position that the world has ever seen. It's almost as if the knight becomes a new type of piece. It's been referred to as an octopus knight, and as you're going to see, the name is quite fitting. Now, the author of this timeless masterpiece, the great Garry Kasparov, went so far as to call this game his supreme creative achievement. And as such, you could make the case that this game is the crowning chess achievement of the entire human race, since Kasparov was really the last world champion that we had before computer programs started to strongly influence how the game was played. So this game number 16, played against Anatoly Karpov in the 1986 World Championship match, is certified 100% human-derived, since I don't think the strongest computer engines had even reached master level at that point. Anatoly Karpov has the white pieces in this one, and he opens the game with e4. Kasparov comes out swinging with a Sicilian defense. We have your standard knight to f3, e6, prioritizing dark squared bishop development while supporting a possible d5. It's a good flexible way to play, since it has the potential to transpose into a number of Sicilian systems. We have the thematic d4 in the exchange of pawns, knight to c6, and now knight to b5 from Karpov, targeting that hole on d6 and threatening to fill it with his invasive steed. Kasparov responds with the most popular defense, d6, preventing it, and now comes c4, setting up the dreaded Maroczy bind, as it's called, on the d5 square, where in theory it should now be much more difficult for black to push his d-pawn to challenge white's monopoly of the center, free his dark squared bishop, and to rid himself of his rather weak d-pawn, which can never be defended by another pawn as long as it's sitting on d6. Kasparov doesn't like to be bound, though. He's not really into that. He'd rather be the one who binds, the binder, and so within the next 10 moves, that's exactly what he becomes. Okay, so how's he going to do this? Well, he begins with knight to f6, attacking e4. Knight to c3 defends. We have a6, driving the knight from b5. It goes to a3. And if you're wondering why not knight to d4 instead, well, this would block the queen's view of d5, allowing black to push his pawn there without losing a pawn. But you know what Kasparov does in this position? He pushes his pawn there anyway, sacrificing it to c takes d5, e takes d5, and e takes d5, attacking the knight on c6. Kasparov continues knight to b4, hitting d5 a third time, threatening to regain the pawn, which white could try to hang on to with bishop to c4, adding defense. And this move was actually played by Karpov in the round 12 game of this match, where Kasparov responded bishop to g4, attacking the queen. And we're not going to get into all the theoretical nuts and bolts of that line, but suffice to say, it led to a short draw, which is why in this game, Karpov decides to try bishop to e2, just preventing bishop to g4, though allowing Kasparov to get his pawn right back with knight takes d5. And that move is the number one choice of Stockfish, but Kasparov is not interested in that pawn. He's got binding on the mind, and so he instead plays a move that I'm about 87% sure that AlphaZero would choose, and that is bishop to c5, just going for the piece activity. Now this is a fine move, fully engine approved, although it was later criticized by Kasparov himself, since it does allow white to simplify the position with a move that Karpov does not find in the game, and that is bishop to e3, challenging that bishop on c5 right away. To which black should respond bishop takes e3, when if white were to capture with the pawn, then black could take on d5 with an attack on the weak and isolated e3 pawn, giving him a significant advantage. However, white does not have to take on e3, because here he has queen to a4 check, picking up the knight on b4. And so with best play from both sides, we would have bishop to d7, queen takes b4, queen to b6, attacking the queen takes b6, and bishop takes b6, leaving black still a pawn down in a queenless middle game, which is not ideal, although the engine evaluates this position as roughly equal. Presumably because of the fact that black does have the bishop pair, white can't really cause him any problems by advancing his d-pawn, which is probably more of a liability here than a strength, due to its isolated nature. But getting back to the game, after bishop to c5, Karpov misses what was later deemed to be his best move, bishop to e3, and instead just castles. He's just trying to do the mature thing, rejecting materialism in favor of king safety, and once again giving Kasparov the opportunity to grab the pawn on d5. But again, he declines, and just castles. Karpov says fine, have it your way, and plays bishop to f3. Now his pawn is adequately defended, knight takes d5 is off the table, but here comes bishop to f5. Kasparov's now cutting through the white position with both of his bishops. Additionally, he's got his knight eyeing c2 and d3. Karpov continues to play actively with bishop to g5, pinning knight to queen. We have some normal looking development with rook to e8, queen to d2, and now a beautifully restrictive move, b5, preventing Karpov from getting his knight back into the game with knight to c4. It of course can't go to c2 either, as that square is hit by both bishop and knight, so it's pretty much stranded out here in no man's land on a3 for the time being, unless you want to make the sad retreat to b1. Karpov just continues with his development though, as if nothing's the matter, with rook a to d1. And he's not wrong, white is still okay here, but after Kasparov pounces into d3 with his knight, white's path to survival has narrowed considerably. Kasparov has now achieved what has famously been referred to as an octopus knight, firmly entrenched deep in the white position, its tentacles reaching so many important squares. It's hitting c1 and e1, preventing both of white's rooks from getting to an open file. It's preventing white from getting his knight back into the game via c2, as that would drop the pawn on b2 with an attack on the rook. It's also converging on f2 with the bishop. b4 is now a threat, which would fork white's knights. So this is looking slightly abysmal for Team White, but believe it or not, he can still maintain equality if he plays the move d6, exposing an attack on black's rook. Karpov didn't play this, but it was pretty much his last chance to untangle himself. The point is, if black moves his attacked rook, then among other equalizing options, white can play knight to d5, doubling up on the pinned f6 knight, and after queen takes pawn on d6, bishop takes f6, and g takes f6, he can play queen to c3, threatening knight takes f6 check, also threatening to win 2 minor pieces for his rook by taking on d3, which is why black's best defense is to just retreat his knight to e5, and this is still an extremely complicated position, and one that we could explore much more deeply, but with Stockfish giving dead equality at a search depth of 46, I'm all good to get back to the game, and I feel confident that you probably are too. In this position, Karpov does not find his best move d6, but instead plays knight a to b1, a losing move. Apparently he thinks he's going to be able to unravel himself, but now Kasparov really starts to cinch up the ligatures, beginning with h6, hitting the bishop. It drops back to h4, it is the best move, maintaining the pin on the knight. Next is b4, attacking the knight on c3, which if it were to go to e2, would block the light squared bishop's diagonal, thus running into trouble with g5 followed by g4, trapping the bishop. So we have knight to a4, which looks much better, hitting the bishop on c5, although that move is also hopelessly losing after Kasparov's response, bishop to d6, which actually threatens a sacrifice on h2 followed by knight to g4, the details of which I'll leave to your imagination. Karpov goes ahead and challenges the bishop right away with bishop to g3. Kasparov develops his rook to the open file with rook to c8, a strong move. Next we have b3. Karpov is looking to get his knight on a4 back in the game via the b2 square now, so it can challenge that constrictive cephalopod on d3. It's a good goal, and it's a plan that would give him a decent fighting chance if he were allowed to execute it, but Kasparov now finds a beautifully devastating way to render knight to b2 completely unplayable. Feel free to pause the video and see if you can spot it. There are actually 2 crushing moves in this position. One of them is bishop to e5, just hitting b2 a second time, and if bishop takes e5, then knight takes e5 would threaten both knight takes bishop on f3, annihilating the white king's pawn cover, and a nasty infiltration with rook to c2, defended by the bishop. But I like Kasparov's move, g5. Now if white tries knight to b2, then black can win material with knight takes b2, queen takes b2, g4 driving the bishop to e2, followed by rook to c2, defended by the bishop, attacking both queen and bishop, and it's all over but the crying, the secret rejoicing, the burying, and then the finger foods. What's played in the game, after Kasparov's brilliant g5, is bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and now g3, giving the bishop an alternative escape square on g2, meaning that knight to b2 is once again on the table. But Kasparov now finds another brilliant move, knight to d7, ready to jump into e5 to back up that kraken on d3, which would be a winning response to knight to b2 if Karpov were to now play it, which he doesn't, but even more forcing would be queen to f6, hitting the b2 knight a second time. Now the knight could go to c4, but this would go down in flames to an exchange sacrifice with rook takes c4 followed by knight to e5, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn on c4. You can explore that nightmare on your own if you'd like, but let's look at the obvious knight takes d3. What's the problem with this? Does this not just give white a free piece after bishop takes d3 and queen takes d3? Well, sure, momentarily, but after knight to e5 attacking both queen and bishop, we don't just have a case of black getting his minor piece back, because here, it's not about winning the bishop on f3, it's about winning the queen. Take a look at the position. Where can the white queen move where it will not be lost after knight takes f3 check? Queen to d2 or to d4 runs into a fork. On e2, the queen comes under fire by the rook, so a remarkable position, but let's take a look at what Karpov tries in the game after this move knight to d7, which is bishop to g2, just getting out of the way of knight to e5. But now Kasparov plays queen to f6, hitting b2 a second time, and so preventing white from moving his knight there. Karpov is now almost completely paralyzed, and getting very close to zugzwang. He can't move any of his pieces without losing material, with the exception of his bishop, which I guess he could move to f3 or to h1. So just an incredible vice grip on the white position here. What's tried is a3. Now if by some impossible miracle Kasparov were to play b takes a3, then white could begin to loosen his shackles with knight takes a3, and this would nearly equalize the position. But Kasparov is never going to do that. He plays a5, just backing up his pawn. We do have a trade on b4, and now, because of that pawn push to a3, Karpov is able to transfer his queen to a2, opening up the d2 square. So things are looking up. And this kind of reminds me of the guy from the Jack London story, I think it's called To Build a Fire, where he gets his legs wet in like 70 degree below zero weather, and he's able to build a fire and sort of start drying himself out. He thinks he just might be okay, but then everything goes horribly wrong, as it continues to do for Karpov, where in this position, Kasparov finds a really unkind move. It's just mean. Bishop to g6, opening the queen's eyes to f2, so that if knight to d2 is played, which it isn't, then there's rook to e2, hitting f2 a third time, threatening rook takes f2, which white has no good way to prevent. So no knight to d2 for you, Karpov. What's played in the game is d6, once again offering Kasparov that d-pawn, which if he were to take it with his queen, removing it from its view of f2, then knight to d2 would be a bit more playable, though still utterly losing. Kasparov isn't interested in giving Karpov even a square inch of breathing room though. He ignores the pawn on d6 and plays g4, just clamping down even harder. This prevents any bishop to h3, which had the potential to be a bit annoying. Karpov now sees that he has the opportunity to attack something, which is exciting, with queen to d2, threatening to take on h6. King to g7 defends. Next we have f3. It makes sense. Karpov is fighting for some kind of activity, hoping to activate his rook now with tempo on the queen. So Kasparov now captures on d6. We do have f takes g4. Kasparov delivers a check with his queen, whose purpose, after king to h1, one might think, is to pick up the pawn on g4 with the queen. But Kasparov has something much more sinister in mind. He plays knight to f6, threatening to take on g4 with the knight. But that's not all he's threatening, because after Karpov plays rook to f4, defending g4 with an attack on the queen, knight takes g4 is no longer playable, but what is playable is something just as bad, knight to e4, hitting the white queen and threatening to come into f2 with check, which will be absolutely devastating. And just to give you an idea of what black is threatening here, let's say white makes some move that doesn't really do anything, like g5. Here the engine's actually giving a forced mate in 24, beginning with knight e to f2 check, and after king to g1 and knight to h3 double check. Now if king to f1, then queen to g1 will be mate. So after king to h1, we have knight d to f2 check. This time there is no king to g1, since the knight on h3 has that square covered. So you got to take the knight. Rook takes f2 is best, and after knight takes f2 check, king to g1, knight to h3 check, king back to h1, we now have queen takes queen on d2. Now if knight takes queen, then white loses the rook to knight to f2 check with the fork. But if rook takes d2, black actually has mate in 3, with rook to e1 check, bishop to f1, bishop to e4 check, rook to g2, and rook takes f1 check mate. Okay, so now that we see the severity of what black is threatening, let's see what white can do to try to deal with it. In our game position, it's pretty obvious that one of these two knights has to go. If white were to capture the knight on e4 with his bishop, then after bishop takes e4 check, his king has no moves. So you got to play rook takes e4, but then after queen takes e4 check, if the queen blocks, then there's knight to f2 check with the fork. The queen is of course pinned and cannot capture. If instead king to g1, black can now get his knight out of danger with knight to e5, threatening a fork on f3, threatening c2 defended by the queen, and then mate on g2, and there's just no defense for white. Okay, what's next? You could try rook takes e4, but here the simplest is probably just knight to f2 check, king to g1, knight to h3 double check, king to h1, queen takes d2, and this is a familiar story. If rook takes queen, then rook to c1 check will force mate in 4, and if knight takes queen, we have knight to f2 check, king to g1, the rook is picked up, leaving black up the exchange with a much better position and an easy win. Okay, let's look at what Karpov tries in the game, which is queen takes knight on d3. Okay, he's momentarily up a piece, but after Kasparov's reply, knight to f2 check, it's not going to last. What's played is rook takes f2, but I gotta quickly show you this line, because it is quite purty. King to g1, where we have knight to h3, double check, king to h1, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, and rook to e1 check. Now if the bishop blocks, then knight takes rook on f4, leaves white with almost all of his pieces hanging. That's curtains. But if rook to f1, we get checkmate in 4 with rook takes f1 check, bishop takes f1, bishop to e4 check, bishop to g2, rook to c1 check, rook to d1, and rook takes d1 checkmate. Okay, our bases are covered. Let's look at Karpov's move, which in this position is rook takes knight on f2. This of course drops the queen to bishop takes d3. We have rook f to d2, looking to pick up the bishop, which is pinned to black's queen. Kasparov could try adding defense with something like rook to e3, but then there's just knight to b2, increasing the pressure. So he plays a much better move, best in the position. Care to guess what it is? The move is queen to e3, allowing Karpov to grab the bishop with rook takes d3. But now comes a gorgeous move, rook to c1. Now if rook takes queen, then we'll have rook takes d1 check, bishop to f1, and after rook takes e3, black's hitting the pinned bishop, hitting the knight, so he will be picking up another piece, and it's game over. So what's tried in the game, after rook to c1, is knight to b2, adding some defense to both of these here rooks, but this gives Kasparov a checkmate by force, which he does now execute. Pause the video if you'd like to try to work it all out. The first move is queen to f2. Threatening rook to e2, threatening rook to e1 check. Karpov plays knight to d2, adding some protection to the f1 square so we can put a piece there in a moment. Of course, this does nothing about the threat of rook to e2, which would now force mate in 2 moves. Kasparov misses this mate in 2 though, and instead finds a mate in 4. With rook takes d1 check, knight takes d1, and now rook to e1 check, at which point Karpov resigns the game, seeing that bishop to f1 will be followed by rook takes f1, knight takes f1, and queen takes f1 checkmate. So there it is, my friends, Garry Kasparov's Immortal masterpiece. Is this his greatest game, or do you think his Immortal rook sacrificed against Topalov has it beat? Or does another one of his games impress you more? Let me know in the comments. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the content and want to see more like it. Hit that like button if you liked the video, and I will see you soon.